What if the most important detail in a billion-dollar deal wasn't hidden in a spreadsheet or a legal clause, but in plain sight on a dinner table? What if the only person to see it wasn't a high-powered lawyer or a financial analyst, but a waitress struggling to pay her rent? This is the incredible true-life story of Julian Thorne, a real estate titan on the verge of the biggest deal of his life, and Clara Vance, the woman who served him his coffee. In a room full of experts, she pointed out a tiny detail everyone had missed, a forgotten line on an old map that would unravel a conspiracy and save him not just millions, but his entire empire. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how one moment of courage changed everything. The air in Aurelia, a Michelin-starred restaurant nestled in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, was different. It wasn't just filtered, it was rarefied, thick with the scent of money, truffle oil, and quiet desperation. For Clara Vance, it was the smell of her nightly cage. At 26, her life was a collection of deferred dreams and mounting bills. 3 years ago, she'd been a promising second-year student at Columbia Law, a star pupil in property law, fascinated by the intricate dance of zoning regulations and historical easements. Then her father's construction business had collapsed, followed swiftly by his health, and Clara had traded her casebooks for a server's notepad to support her mother. Every night, she glided between tables, her smile a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. She wore her uniform, a crisp black dress like armor. Her shoes, however, were a betrayal. They were sensible black, and the insoles were worn down to nothing, a constant aching reminder of the miles she walked between the kitchen and the elite of New York City. She served men and women who wouldn't think twice about spending her monthly rent on a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux. Tonight, Table 12 was the epicenter of the restaurant's universe. It was the private alcove reserved for Julian Thorne, a man whose name was etched in steel and glass across the city's skyline. Thorne was a titan of real estate, a self-made billionaire with a reputation for ruthless vision and an almost supernatural ability to see value where others saw decay. He wasn't loud or flamboyant like the new money tech crowd. He was a predator of a different breed, patient observant with eyes the color of a stormy sea that missed nothing. Or so the legend went. Clara knew of him, of course. It was impossible to live in New York and not know of Thorne developments. His latest project, the Hudson Spire, was the stuff of headlines, a breathtakingly ambitious mixed-use skyscraper set to redefine the western edge of Midtown. It was his legacy project, the crown jewel of a lifetime of work. Tonight, he was not alone. He was flanked by his inner circle. There was David Sterling, a senior partner from the prestigious law firm, Cravath, Swain and Moore. His silver hair perfectly coiffed, and his suit so sharp it could cut glass. Opposite him sat 2 younger, ravenous-looking associates from his firm, their faces pale with a mixture of awe and terror. And next to Thorne was his own CFO, a grim-faced man named Robert Mills. The tension emanating from the table was a palpable force, warping the polite ambiance of Aurelia. Clara's job was to be invisible, a ghost who refilled water glasses and cleared plates without a sound. But she couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation as she served the amuse-bouche. The final signatory papers from Viridian Global are ready. Due diligence is complete, rock solid. Closing is in 48 hours, no turning back. Viridian Global. Clara recognized the name. They were Thorne's chief rival, a notoriously aggressive investment group led by the cunning Marcus Holloway. For Thorne to be in a deal with them meant the stakes were astronomical. The men had unfurled a massive document across the pristine white tablecloth. It wasn't paper. It was a thick, vellum-like sheet, a high-resolution architectural site plan of the proposed Hudson Spire location. It was covered in property lines, topographical data, and layers of municipal zoning codes. The lawyers pointed at clauses, their gold pens flashing under the dim lighting. Thorne just stared at the plan, his jaw tight, his gaze sweeping over the intricate details like a general surveying a battlefield. The demolition permits are green-lit, the environmental impact reports are signed off, and the zoning variances have all been approved by the city board. Sterling said, his voice a smooth, confident purr. "Julian, this is the cleanest, most straightforward billion-dollar land acquisition I have ever seen. Holloway's team at Viridian has been surprisingly cooperative." Thorne grunted a non-committal sound that made the younger lawyers flinch. "Cooperation from a shark like Holloway is what worries me, David. It means he thinks he's already won." Clara placed a basket of freshly baked sourdough on the table, her movements fluid and silent. As she leaned over, her gaze was inadvertently drawn to the site plan. It was a beautiful, complex document. For a fleeting second, the old, familiar thrill of her law studies sparked within her, the love for the puzzle, for the story that maps and deeds told. She saw the familiar grid of Manhattan, the bold lines of the proposed foundation, the faint dotted lines indicating subterranean utilities. Then she moved away, melting back into the shadows. It was just another table, another set of powerful men deciding the fate of the city, while she worried about making her share of the tips. She had no idea that the spark of interest she felt was about to ignite a firestorm. The dinner progressed like a meticulously choreographed play. Courses came and went. Wine was poured, tasted, and approved with a curt nod from Thorne. The conversation was a low, intense hum of legal jargon and financial figures that were so large they sounded fictional. A 9-figure escrow, amortization schedules, penalty clauses in the event of default. Clara operated on autopilot, her body performing the familiar dance of service while her mind drifted. She thought about the letter from Columbia that sat on her nightstand, a polite inquiry about whether she intended to re-enroll, a painful reminder of the life she'd been forced to abandon. She thought about her mother, who was trying to stay positive, but whose worry was a constant presence in their small Queen's apartment. It was during the main course, a pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction, that it happened. The legal team had finished their meal quickly, eager to get back to the documents. Thorne, however, ate slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving the site plan, which was still spread across the table. One of the junior associates had spilled a drop of water near the edge of the plan, and David Sterling had shot him a look that could curdle milk. As Clara reached across the table to clear Robert Mill's plate, her eyes fell upon the map again. This time she wasn't just glancing. Her focus snagged on one specific area, the southeastern corner of the proposed foundation, near what would be the main public plaza. It was a dense section of the plan, layered with utility lines for water gas and fiber optics. But beneath all that, there was something else. It was a ghost. A faint, almost imperceptible line, rendered in a slightly different shade of blue-gray ink, as if it were from an older underlying survey that had been incorporated into the new digital rendering. It was an elegant, looping curve, completely incongruous with the rigid geometric lines of modern infrastructure. It looked less like a pipe and more like a calligrapher's flourish. Alongside it was a tiny, archaic symbol she almost didn't recognize. Almost. A memory, sharp and vivid, jolted through her. Professor Albright, Columbia Law Property. Law 101. A stuffy lecture hall. Albright was a wonderfully eccentric man, obsessed with the forgotten history buried beneath New York City's concrete skin. He'd spent a whole week on historical easements and ancient water rights. "Remember, class?" His voice echoed in her mind. "The city is built on layers. Before the modern water system, there was the Croton Aqueduct, an engineering marvel of its time. While most of it is history, certain sections, certain access conduits and pressure points still have protected historical easements attached to them. They are ghosts on the city's deeds. They are incredibly rare, almost never invoked, and a developer's absolute worst nightmare. The city will protect them with draconian fervor. You cannot build on them, you cannot move them, and you cannot obstruct access to them. Finding one on your site plan is like finding a live bomb from the 19th century buried in your basement." Professor Albright had then shown them a slide of the specific archival symbol used by the 19th century surveyors to denote a protected conduit access point. A small circle with a bisecting, wavy line. The exact symbol she was looking at now. Clara froze her hand, hovering over the plate. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. It couldn't be. Thorne was paying David Sterling's firm, Cravath, Swain and Moore, probably $500,000 or more for this one transaction alone. They would have commissioned the most detailed geological and historical surveys money could buy. A team of dozens of paralegals and associates would have scoured every document, every map, every city record for precisely this kind of issue. It was impossible that they had all missed it. She straightened up the plate, heavy in her hand, and looked at the men. They were hunched over the document again, arguing about a tax liability clause. They were looking at the words, at the numbers, at the bold, obvious lines. They weren't seeing the ghost. Their eyes, trained for modern legal combat, were completely blind to the faint whisper from the past. Clara backed away from the table, her mind racing. What should she do? Nothing. It was the safe option. She was a waitress. Interrupting Julian Thorne's billion-dollar deal meeting would get her fired instantly. She'd be a laughing stock. The sheer arrogance of it, a server correcting a team from one of the world's top law firms. She walked towards the kitchen, her legs unsteady. But Professor Albright's words haunted her. A developer's absolute worst nightmare. A live bomb. She knew what an undiscovered easement of this magnitude meant. It wouldn't just delay the project, it would kill it. The foundation couldn't be poured as planned. The entire architectural design would be compromised. The cost to redesign and repermit, if it were even possible, would be astronomical. And the penalty clauses in the deal with Viridian Global, she could only imagine they would be catastrophic, designed to cripple Thorne if he failed to break ground on schedule. Julian Thorne's face flashed in her mind. The stress in his eyes, the way he'd said, "cooperation from a shark," is what worries me. This felt wrong. It felt like a trap. A detail so obscure, so perfectly hidden in plain sight, that only someone with an obsession for historical minutiae, or someone who knew exactly where to look, would find it. Maybe Viridian Global's team hadn't been cooperative. Maybe they'd been cunning. Clara stood by the kitchen door, her breath catching in her throat. She looked back at table 12. She could walk away, finish her shift, and go home. In 48 hours, Julian Thorne's empire would face a crisis, and she would be serving someone else duck breast. Or she could risk everything: her job, her dignity, on a ghost from a law class she'd been forced to quit. The choice felt like standing on the edge of a skyscraper, the wind whipping around her with a single terrifying step to take. For 10 agonizing minutes, Clara was trapped in a state of paralysis. She went through the motions, clearing a nearby table, taking a drink order, her mind a screaming vortex of indecision. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to stay silent. She was nobody. These men were titans cushioned by wealth and pedigrees from Ivy League schools she could no longer afford. To them, she was part of the decor, a functional object no more sentient than the crystal water glass she filled. But the image of the symbol on the map was burned into her mind. It was more than a legal curiosity. It was a matter of principle. It was the kind of intricate justice-defining detail that had drawn her to the law in the first place. Letting this go felt like a betrayal of the person she had once hoped to become. She looked over at Thorne. He had his reading glasses on now. His brow furrowed as he scanned a document, his finger tracing a line of text. He looked tired. He looked like a man carrying the weight of an empire, surrounded by people paid to protect him, yet utterly alone. Damn it. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she smoothed the front of her uniform. Her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She picked up a silver water pitcher from a service station, her hand trembling so slightly that the water shivered. The pitcher was her prop, her reason for approaching the table, her passport into their world for 30 seconds. She walked towards them, each step a conscious, deliberate act of will. The floor felt miles long. As she neared, David Sterling was speaking, his voice dripping with condescending reassurance. Julian, I promise you my team has been over every square inch of that plot. We ran a full title search, a historical survey, a municipal lien search. Everything. It's clean. The Viridian reports confirm it. We are clear to close. Thorne still looked unconvinced. He rubbed his temples. I just have a bad feeling, David. Feelings don't hold up in court. Sterling chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. This was it, now or never. Clara stepped forward, pitcher in hand. Excuse me, Mr. Thorne, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the bubble of tension around the table it sounded like a gunshot. All 4 men looked up at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and annoyance. David Sterling's face instantly curdled into a mask of disdain. A waitress, interrupting. Your water, sir, she said, her voice miraculously steady as she reached for his glass. It was a lie. His glass was still 3/4 full. I'm fine, thank you, Sterling said curtly, a clear dismissal. Clara ignored him, her eyes fixed on Julian Thorne. Mr. Thorne, she repeated, a little louder this time. I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Clara. Thorne's gaze sharpened. He didn't dismiss her. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. What is it, Clara? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Her throat went dry. The faces of the lawyers were a blur of hostility. Sir, I happened to notice the site plan for the Hudson Spire. I used to study law, specifically property law. Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. Is that so? Well, we have that covered, thank you. He waved a dismissive hand at her. We're in the middle of something important. David, Thorne said, his voice quiet, but laced with steel. Sterling fell silent immediately. Thorne's eyes were still locked on Clara. You were saying... The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. The southeastern corner of the foundation, she said, pointing with her free hand, the one not holding the pitcher. near the proposed plaza. There's a marking on the plan, an old one. It's faint, but it's there. One of the junior associates, eager to prove his worth, leaned over the map. I don't see anything but the Con Ed and water mains. It's underneath, Clara insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. It looks like an archival symbol for a Croton or aqueduct easement, a protected conduit access point from the mid-1800s survey. The silence that followed was profound. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief. David Sterling stared at her, as if she had just started speaking in tongues. He then slowly bent over the map, his face inches from the vellum, a look of theatrical skepticism on his face. A Croton. What? He scoffed, squinting. There is nothing here. A smudge on the print, perhaps, a graphical artifact from the scan. No, Clara said, her voice firm. It's a circle with a wavy line through it. The symbol is specific. If it's what I think it is, you can't build there. The city would issue a stop work order the moment your excavation crew touches it. It's a non-negotiable historical preservation easement. Sterling straightened up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This is absurd. Julian, are we really going to listen to zoning advice from the wait staff? The insult hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but she held her ground. She looked directly at Thorne. She had said her piece. It was up to him now. Thorne didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the map. He just looked at Clara. He was studying her not with contempt, but with an unnerving, analytical intensity. He saw the worn-out shoes, the slight tremor in her hand, but he also saw the unshakable conviction in her eyes. It was a look he recognized, the look of someone who was certain of their facts. In his world, certainty was a rare and valuable commodity, and his own gut had been telling him something was wrong all night. He made a decision. "Robert," he said to his CFO, "get Paul Brenner on the phone, now." Paul Brenner. The name sent a jolt through the lawyers. Brenner was the head of the city's Department of Buildings, a notoriously prickly and incorruptible public servant. Calling him at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night was the nuclear option. "Julian, that's really not necessary." Sterling began, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "We can have my team run a sub-level archival search in the morning. This is... Get him on the phone." Thorne repeated, his voice dangerously low. He then turned his gaze back to Clara. The picture in her hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "You don't go anywhere. Sit down." He gestured to an empty chair at the far end of the table. Clara's mind reeled. She, a waitress, was being told to sit at Julian Thorne's table. David Sterling looked like he might have an aneurysm. With numb obedience, she placed the water pitcher on a nearby service stand and walked to the chair, her legs stiff. She sat down, her simple black uniform, a stark contrast to the sea of bespoke suits. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, the other patrons sensing the sudden dramatic shift in gravity around table 12. The wait was over. The interruption had been made. And now the consequences were about to begin. The atmosphere at the table had transformed from a high-stakes business meeting into a tense, silent tribunal. Clara sat stiffly in her chair, acutely aware of the daggers being stared into her back by the restaurant manager, who was hovering nervously near the kitchen entrance. The two junior lawyers from Cravath were whispering furiously to each other, occasionally glancing at their boss, David Sterling, whose face was a stony mask of controlled rage. He was humiliated, and his fury was directed entirely at Clara. Robert Mills, the CFO, had stepped away to make the call. Julian Thorne sat in silence, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed on the spot on the map Clara had indicated. He didn't speak to her. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply waited, an unnerving stillness emanating from him. It was the stillness of a predator, waiting for its prey to reveal itself. After 5 minutes that stretched into an eternity, Mills returned his phone pressed to his ear. He held it out to Thorne. "It's Brenner," he mouthed. Thorne took the phone. "Paul. Julian Thorne. I apologize for the late hour. Yes, it's important." Thorne's side of the conversation was brief and brutally efficient. He didn't ask questions. He gave instructions. "I need you to pull the archival surveys for Lot 74B, Section 12, Manhattan. Specifically, the original 1842 Croton Aqueduct Survey, overlays. Yes, the ones the title insurance companies always miss. I'm looking for a conduit access easement on the southeastern boundary." There was a pause. Thorne listened, his expression unchanging. From across the table, Clara could hear the faint, tinny sound of furious typing from the other end of the line. "I'll wait," Thorne said, and then settled into another long silence. David Sterling began to fidget, adjusting his tie, clearing his throat. "Julian, this is highly unorthodox," he hissed in a low voice. "Going around my team to the DOB commissioner based on a waitress's hunch. It undermines my firm's credibility." Thorne finally turned his gaze to Sterling, and the cold fury in his eyes made the high-powered lawyer physically recoil. "Your credibility was undermined the moment you told me this deal was rock solid, while there was a potential live bomb in the basement," Thorne said, his voice a low growl, unconsciously echoing Professor Albright's words. "You told me you were the best, David. The best don't miss things." Suddenly, Thorne's focus on the phone sharpened. "Yes, Paul. You've found it. Read me the designation." Thorne listened, and for the first time that night, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't anger or surprise. It was a cold, grim confirmation. Designation CAE-9. Protected under the 1908 Municipal Preservation Act. Cannot be altered, moved, or access obstructed in perpetuity. I see. And what is the penalty for unauthorized excavation? Another pause. Thorne's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. Demolition of infringing structures and a fine of up to 200% of the projected construction cost. I understand. Thank you, Paul. Yes, I'll be in touch. He ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table. The click of the plastic hitting the wood sounded like a gavel. The silence was absolute. "Well, David," Thorne said, his voice deceptively soft. Sterling was pale, his confident facade completely shattered. "Julian, it must be a mistake, an archival error. It's never been enforced. Brenner said it was last inspected in 1998. Thorne cut in his voice like ice. "It's active, it's real, and it runs directly through the proposed location for the primary load-bearing pylons of the Hudson Spire." He tapped the map with a single damning finger. "Right here." The two junior associates looked physically ill. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a career-ending, firm-destroying blunder. A 9-figure error. Thorne turned his attention to his CFO. "Robert, what's our penalty exposure to Viridian if we fail to break ground by the contractual deadline?" Mills swallowed hard. "It's severe, Julian. We forfeit the $50 million escrow, and there's an additional $75 million non-performance penalty. $125 million gone. Not to mention the hundreds of millions already spent on planning design and legal fees. The Hudson Spire was dead before a single shovelful of dirt had been turned. Thorne leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He seemed to deflate the immense weight of the catastrophe settling on him. Then a new look entered his eyes, the look of a fighter. "They knew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Holloway and his people at Viridian. They knew this was here." Sterling, desperate to deflect blame, seized on this. "Yes, it has to be. They buried it. They must have used an old survey for their own due diligence reports, found this, and then provided us with a clean version. It's bad faith negotiation. It's fraud. It's brilliant," Thorne corrected him, a strange, almost admiring glint in his eye. "They let us do all the work, run up all the costs, get within 48 hours of closing. Then after we've signed and the money is transferred, they anonymously tip off the Department of Buildings. The project gets shut down, we default, and they collect $125 million for doing nothing. Then they swoop in, buy the land from us in bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar, and propose a new, smaller building that works around the easement. They played you, David. They played all of you for fools." The brutal, simple elegance of the trap was laid bare on the table. The room was thick with the stench of failure. Then Julian Thorne did something no one expected. He turned his chair slightly to face the person at the end of the table, the one person who wasn't on his multi-million-dollar payroll. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded different now. It had weight. "How did you know?" All eyes turned to her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. "I told you," she said, her voice small but clear. "I studied property law. My professor. He had a fascination with the old Croton system. He called them ghosts on the deeds. The symbol. I just remembered it." Thorne stared at her for a long moment, the cogs turning in his brilliant, calculating mind. He saw the whole story, the dropped-out law student, the sharp memory, the courage to speak up. While his team of experts had been looking at the deal, she had been looking at the truth. He stood up, the sudden movement causing everyone to flinch. He walked around the table and stopped directly in front of her. He looked down, and Clara had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You didn't just save me from $125 million penalty," he said, his voice a low, intense rumble that was for her alone. "You saved the company. You saved my legacy." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black business card. He placed it on the table in front of her. "Be at my office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Then he turned to the rest of the shell-shocked group. "The dinner is over. David, have your team at my office at 8 a.m. We're going to war." The next morning, Clara stood in front of the Thorne Tower on Park Avenue, a gleaming black monolith that seemed to pierce the sky. She was wearing her only interview-appropriate outfit, a simple black blazer and slacks she'd bought at a thrift store 2 years ago. In her hand, she clutched the heavy, expensive business card. Julian Thorne, Chairman, Thorne Developments. Walking into the lobby was like stepping into another dimension. The air was cool and silent. The floors were polished Italian marble, and the reception desk was a single, massive piece of carved granite. She gave her name, and the receptionist's polite smile didn't flicker, as she undoubtedly registered that this was not one of their usual power-suited visitors. "Mr. Thorne is expecting you, 80th floor." The elevator ride was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. As the doors opened, she was greeted not by another receptionist, but by a calm older woman who introduced herself as Eleanor Mr. Thorne's executive assistant. "Clara, thank you for coming. Mr. Thorne is just finishing a meeting. Please have a seat." The office was less an office and more a sky fortress. One entire wall was a sheet of glass offering a godlike view of Central Park. The furniture was minimalist and exquisite. On a large table, the very same site plan from the restaurant was spread out now, covered in red marker annotations. Clara sat her hands folded nervously in her lap. She could hear the muffled but furious sounds of Julian Thorne's voice from behind a large closed door. He was in his war meeting with David Sterling's legal team. After 20 minutes, the door burst open. David Sterling and his associates emerged, their faces ashen. Sterling looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. He saw Clara sitting there, and a look of pure, unadulterated hatred flashed in his eyes before he quickly composed himself and hurried towards the elevators. He knew his firm's relationship with Thorne Developments was over. A moment later, Eleanor beckoned Clara in. Julian Thorne was standing by the window, looking out over the city. His city. He turned as she entered, and his expression was different from the night before. The stress was still there, but it was overlaid with a kind of focused electric energy. "Clara, thank you for coming. Coffee?" "No, thank you, sir." He gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his vast desk. "Please." She sat down. He remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the window. "Last night," he began, "you did more than spot a symbol on a map. You gave me leverage. The kind of leverage that can turn a catastrophe into an opportunity." Clara listened, unsure of where this was going. Sterling and his team spent the last 2 hours verifying everything. The trap was even more elegant than I imagined. Viridian Global acquired a small defunct archival company 6 months ago. That company was the only one that held the original undigitized linen maps of that specific section from the 1842 survey. They knew. They had the only physical proof, and they buried it. They committed fraud through omission. It would be hard to prove in court, but the threat of litigation, the threat of exposing Marcus Holloway's methods to the world, that's a powerful weapon. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I had a call with Holloway an hour ago. I told him the deal was off. He feigned surprise, then anger. He threatened to sue to take our escrow. I let him rant. Then I mentioned a small protected easement. Designation CAE 9. I told him I had a sworn affidavit from the Commissioner of the Department of Buildings and was preparing to file a suit against Viridian for fraudulent inducement." Thorne smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. The silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I've heard all year. The great Marcus Holloway, speechless. He walked over to his desk and leaned against it. The tables have turned. Holloway knows he's caught. His bluff has been called. Now he doesn't want a lawsuit. He will almost certainly lose one that would tarnish his firm's reputation forever. Now he wants to negotiate. Clara was stunned. In less than 12 hours, Thorne had completely reversed his position, turning from victim to aggressor. "He wants to avoid the penalty," she asked. "Oh, he's going to pay a penalty," Thorne said with a dark chuckle. "But not to me. I gave him a new offer. The deal for the land is back on. But the price has changed. He will sell the land to me, not for the agreed-upon $1.2 billion, but for $900 million. He will eat a $300 million loss." Clara's jaw dropped. A $300 million swing. "Furthermore," Thorne continued, "his firm will be responsible for all costs associated with the architectural redesign to accommodate the easement." My new team of architects and lawyers I fired Cravath this morning estimates that will be another 50 to 60 million. So Marcus Holloway's brilliant trap is going to end up costing him over $350 million. And I, Thorne grinned, am going to get my Hudson Spire on budget with the most favorable land deal in modern New York history. He had not just averted disaster, he had profited from it colossally. It was a masterclass in high-stakes corporate warfare, and Clara had handed him the singular perfect bullet for his gun. That's incredible, she breathed. No, Thorne corrected her. It is a logical outcome derived from having the right information at the right time. Information that you provided. He fell silent, studying her again, with that intense analytical gaze. Clara felt her nerve endings tingle. This was the moment of truth. She expected him to offer her a check, a finder's fee. A generous one, no doubt. Enough to pay off her family's debts and maybe even go back to school. It would be a life-changing amount of money. But Julian Thorne hadn't become a billionaire by thinking like everyone else. I looked into you, Clara, he said quietly. Columbia Law, top 5% of your class, dropped out for family reasons, working at Aurelia for the last 3 years. Clara felt exposed, her whole life summed up in a few stark sentences. Yes, sir. Last night I saw 2 things, he went on. I saw someone with an exceptional eye for detail, the kind I haven't seen in years, and I saw someone with the courage to speak truth to power, even at great personal risk. Those 2 qualities together are rarer than a flawless diamond. They are wasted on serving overpriced duck to men like David Sterling. He walked around his desk and sat down opposite her, leaning forward, his gaze locking with hers. A check is an insult to what you did, he said. It's a transaction. I'm not interested in a transaction. I'm interested in an investment. Clara's heart skipped a beat. An investment, sir? I am prepared to pay for the full remainder of your tuition and living expenses to finish your degree at Columbia Law, he said, his voice even. And upon your graduation, there will be a position waiting for you here in my in-house counsel's office, not as a junior associate fetching coffee, as my personal advisor. Your job will be to look at all my deals, all my plans, and find the ghosts, to see what everyone else misses. He leaned back. I'm not offering you a reward, Clara. I'm offering you a future. Your future. The one you were forced to give up. Clara was speechless. Her mind was reeling, unable to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. It wasn't just money. It was her dream. Her life handed back to her more brilliant and full of promise than she had ever dared to imagine. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the incredible view of the city behind him. She had walked into that restaurant, a waitress, invisible and struggling. She was walking out with a new life, all because she had pointed out a ghost on a map. The news of the renegotiated Hudson Spire deal sent shockwaves through the closed circles of New York's real estate and finance communities. The official story, carefully curated by Thorne's new PR team, was that a final review by Thorne Developments had uncovered previously unrecorded municipal easements leading to a mutually agreed-upon price adjustment with Viridian Global. It was a bland corporate statement that completely masked the brutal high-stakes drama that had transpired. But within the industry, whispers turned into legends. Marcus Holloway, the predator, had been declawed and humiliated. He was forced to issue a statement about the complexities of developing in a historic city and the importance of partnership, all while swallowing a loss that would haunt his firm's balance sheet for years. He became a cautionary tale. David Sterling and the firm of Cravath, Swain and Moore suffered a quieter but equally devastating fate. Julian Thorne was one of their most significant clients. Losing him was a blow, but the reason for it was a cataclysm. The story of their epic blunder of being outsmarted by a waitress spread like wildfire. Thorne didn't need to sue them for malpractice. The damage to their reputation was punishment enough. Sterling was quietly moved to a senior advisory role, a corporate euphemism for being put out to pasture. The two junior associates who had been at the dinner were let go, their careers tarnished, before they had even begun. The ripple effects of Clara's observation were vast and unforgiving. Clara, meanwhile, felt like she was living in a dream. The day after her meeting with Thorne, the first tuition check arrived at Columbia University's bursar's office, covering her entire remaining balance. A generous stipend was deposited into her barren bank account, managed by Thorne's family office. When she called her mother to tell her the news, her mother wept with a joy and relief so profound it left Clara breathless. She could finally quit her job at Aurelia. Her last shift was surreal. She glided through the familiar space, no longer a prisoner of it. The demanding patrons, the condescending managers, the clatter of the kitchen on off it could touch her. She was a ghost of a different kind now, already halfway in another world. As she was leaving, she saw her manager berating a new waitress for a minor mistake. A few weeks ago, that would have been her. She felt a pang of solidarity, and on an impulse, she took the crisp $100 bill Thorne had pressed into her hand the night of the dinner, and anonymously slipped it into the young waitress's locker. Returning to Columbia was like coming home. The weight of her financial worries was gone, replaced by a singular burning focus. She attacked her studies with a renewed passion, but she saw her classes through a new lens. It wasn't just theory anymore. She had seen firsthand how a single forgotten clause, a faint line on a map, could bring an empire to its knees or build a new one. She excelled her professors, noting a new maturity and sharpness in her arguments. Julian Thorne was true to his word. He left her alone to focus on her studies, but his presence was a quiet, constant force in her life. Every few months, Eleanor, his assistant, would call to check in. Occasionally, a courier would deliver a file to her apartment, not for legal advice, but for her perspective. It would be a new architectural rendering or a complex zoning proposal. "Mr. Thorne is interested in your initial thoughts," the note would say. "Look for the ghosts." It was during her final semester, while working late in the law library, that she uncovered a twist she never saw coming. She had taken an elective on corporate espionage and opposition research taught by a grizzled ex-FBI agent. For their final paper, they had to analyze a real-world case study. Clara, for obvious reasons, chose the Thorne-Viridian deal using only publicly available information. As she pieced together the timeline, something felt off. Viridian had acquired the small archival company, Hudson Archival Services, 6 months before the deal. But according to SEC filings, Hudson Archival had been on the brink of bankruptcy. Why would Viridian buy a failing company? Digging deeper, she looked into the company's employee records just before the acquisition. She found something that made the hair on her arms stand up. A junior paralegal who had worked at Hudson Archival for 5 years had left the company 1 week before the Viridian acquisition. His name was Thomas Riley. 2 weeks later, Thomas Riley was hired as a junior paralegal at Cravath, Swain and Moore. He had been assigned to David Sterling's team. He had been one of the dozens of paralegals who had worked on the due diligence for the Hudson Spire deal. It wasn't just a trap, it was an inside job. Viridian hadn't just hoped Thorne's team would miss the easement. They had planted a mole to ensure they would. Riley, with his intimate knowledge of the obscure archival maps, would have been the one person who could easily find the easement. His job was to search for it and declare the title clean. He had buried the truth from within the walls of Thorne's own legal counsel. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The conspiracy was deeper and more sinister than even Thorne had realized. She immediately compiled her findings into a clear, concise report, citing every public document. She scanned it and sent it in an encrypted email to Thorne with a simple subject line. The ghost had help. The response came less than 10 minutes later. It was one word: tomorrow. The next day, Clara was once again in the Sky Fortress office on the 80th floor. This time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. Julian Thorne was sitting at his desk, her report printed out in front of him. His expression was grim. "Thomas Riley," Thorne said, tapping the name on the paper. "My new security team did a deep dive on him this morning. He was paid $250,000 by a shell corporation linked to Viridian Global 3 days after he was hired by Cravath, a signing bonus. After I fired the firm, he resigned and has since disappeared. Probably sipping cocktails on a beach somewhere with no extradition treaty." He looked at Clara, and there was a new level of respect in his eyes. "You found the trigger man. You gave me the final piece of the puzzle. Now I can not only sue Holloway for fraud, but I can refer him to the district attorney for corporate sabotage and conspiracy. I can ruin him completely and utterly." He fell silent for a moment, staring out at his city. "And I will." Clara watched him, understanding that in his world there was no room for mercy in the face of such a calculated betrayal. Thorne turned back to her, the dark mood seeming to evaporate, replaced by his usual focused intensity. "You graduate in 2 weeks." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said. "Your office is being prepared. It's next to mine." He gestured towards an adjoining door she hadn't noticed before. "You won't be working for my chief counsel. You'll be working for me. You're not just here to vet deals. You're here to be my eyes, my institutional memory, my devil's advocate. You have a gift, Clara. A clarity of sight that power and money seem to blind in other people. I need that. I am willing to pay whatever it takes to have it." He stood up and walked to the window, beckoning her to join him. She stood beside him, looking down at the incredible tapestry of New York. From this height, the city looked like a giant, intricate map. "Look down there," Thorne said, his voice softer now. "Every one of those buildings started as a dream, a plan on a piece of paper. But it's also a web of contracts, deeds, regulations, and forgotten histories. It's a jungle. To build something that lasts, you need more than just steel and glass. You need to understand the ghosts. You need to see the whole board, not just the pieces in front of you." He turned to her, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "You see the whole board, Clara Vance. Welcome to Thorne Developments." Standing there high above the city, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her to this impossible moment. The worn-out shoes, the smell of truffle oil, the terror of speaking up the memory of a passionate professor. It hadn't been one single moment of courage, but 1,000 small moments of perseverance that had led her here. She hadn't just saved a billionaire millions. She had reclaimed her own stolen future, and in doing so had found a place where her unique way of seeing the world was not just valued, but essential. She was no longer a waitress. She was the guardian of the ghosts, the architect of a new life, and her work was just beginning. Clara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that the most valuable person in the room isn't always the one with the loudest voice or the most expensive suit. It's often the one who sees what others overlook. Her journey from a struggling waitress to a key advisor for a billion-dollar empire wasn't about luck. It was about the courage to trust her own knowledge and the bravery to speak up when it mattered most. It reminds us that potential is everywhere in everyone waiting for a single opportunity to change the world. So the next time you think you're just a small part of a big machine, remember Clara and the ghost on the map. If this story inspired you or made you think, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And for more incredible, true-life stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure you click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own potential. Thank you for watching. The sound that broke Cressida Bishop's life wasn't a scream, but the delicate shatter of a champagne flute on marble. It was her husband's gala, a celebration of his fashion empire, and she stood frozen 5 months pregnant, watching him kiss another woman under the glare of a crystal chandelier. The woman was his new star designer, but it wasn't the kiss that shattered her. It was his words when he finally saw her. He didn't look guilty, just annoyed. Darling. He sighed, a whisper of pure venom. Don't be so dramatic. It's just business. You should focus on your little hobby. You know the baby. Her world didn't just crack. It atomized. That was the night she walked out with nothing but a broken heart and a life growing inside her, completely unaware that the key to his entire kingdom was already in her hands. Life in the Montclair penthouse was an exercise in curated perfection, from the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline like a living masterpiece to the stark white orchids that were replaced every 3 days. Everything was designed to be beautiful, flawless and untouchable. Cressida, or Cress as she preferred, often felt like just another one of those exquisite, fragile objects. Her husband, Lucius Montclair, was the architect of this world. He was the charismatic, razor-sharp CEO of Montclair Couture, an empire built on the dazzling, cutthroat world of high fashion. To the public, he was a visionary. To his board, a titan. To Cress, he was the man who had swept her off her feet, a whirlwind of ambition and charm, who saw her a young, promising textile designer and decided she would be his. Their meeting had been a fairy tale. She was interning at a small artisanal fabric mill when he'd come scouting for new materials. He was captivated not by her designs, which he called charming but provincial, but by her quiet grace and the way she seemed to complement his own dazzling persona. He pursued her with the same relentless focus he applied to a corporate acquisition. Within 6 months, they were married. Cress, swept away by the grandeur and the intensity of his affection, believed she was the luckiest woman alive. She soon learned, however, that being Mrs. Montclair meant her own ambitions were expected to be packed away like last season's collection. Her design sketchbook, once filled with vibrant, innovative patterns, gathered dust on a shelf in her cavernous walk-in closet. When she tried to show him her work, he would pat her hand indulgently. "That's lovely, my dear," he'd say, his eyes already on his phone. "But you have a much more important role now. You're the face of my home, the hostess of my parties. Leave the hard work to me." The penthouse, for all its beauty, became her gilded cage. Her days were a structured sequence of appointments, with event planners, nutritionists, and personal trainers, all meticulously scheduled by Lucius's assistant. Her friends were Lucius's friends, wives of bankers and executives, who spoke of charity galas and summering in the Hamptons, their conversations as sterile and polished as the marble floors beneath their feet. Cress felt a part of herself, the creative, passionate part, slowly suffocating. The news of her pregnancy should have been a joyous occasion, a fresh start. When she told Lucius, placing the positive test on his polished mahogany desk, he looked up from a quarterly report, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile. He simply nodded slowly. "Good," he said, as if she had just successfully closed a deal. "A son, I hope. An heir is good for the brand's image. Legacy." His reaction was a cold splash of water, but Cress tried to rationalize it. He was a busy man, always thinking about the business. She threw herself into the pregnancy, hoping the shared experience of creating a life would bridge the growing chasm between them. She started sketching again this time, designs for baby clothes using soft organic fabrics. She imagined a small independent line, something of her own. One evening, brimming with a rare surge of confidence, she laid out her sketches and business proposal on the dining room table before he got home. She had worked on it for weeks, researching suppliers, costing out materials, and even creating a brand name, Bishop's Weave, a nod to her family name and her grandfather who had been a tailor. Lucius walked in, loosening his tie, his face tight with the stress of the day. He glanced at the papers scattered across the table, and his lip curled into a faint sneer. "What's all this? It's my idea," Cress began, her voice trembling slightly. "A luxury baby clothing line. The market is strong, and I have a unique perspective on sustainable fabrics." He picked up a sketch of a tiny, hand-stitched romper. He held it for a moment before letting it drop back onto the table. "Cressida, we've discussed this. Your hobby is charming, but it's not a business. Montclair Couture deals in power and desire, not baby clothes. It would dilute the brand." "It wouldn't be part of Montclair Couture," she insisted, her heart sinking. "It would be mine, something I built." He laughed, then a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Built, darling, you have no idea what it takes to build something. You live in a world I built for you. Your job is to be here, to be beautiful, and soon to be a mother. That should be enough for you. Now let's clear this away. We have the Future of Fashion Gala tomorrow night, and I need you to look rested." The finality in his tone was absolute. He didn't see her. He saw a function, a role to be played. The dismissal of her dream of her very identity beyond being his wife was more painful than any overt act of cruelty. As she gathered her sketches, her hands shaking, she felt the first true deep crack appear in the flawless facade of her life. The cage was no longer gilded. It was just a cage, and for the first time, she was rattling the bars, wondering if she had the strength to break them. The gala, meant to be a celebration of his success, now loomed like a final judgment on her own life's failures. The Future of Fashion Gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, and Lucius Montclair was its undisputed king. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. Waiters weaved through the throngs with trays of shimmering champagne, and the air hummed with the electric buzz of power money and influence. Cress felt a familiar sense of detachment as she stood by Lucius's side, a practiced smile fixed on her face. She wore a deep emerald gown of Montclair silk, a dress chosen for her, designed to perfectly accommodate her 5-month baby bump, while still exuding effortless elegance. To the outside world, she was the picture of a serene, glowing mother-to-be, the perfect consort to the man of the hour. Inside, she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Lucius's dismissal of her business idea the night before had left a hollow ache in her chest that no amount of couture could cover. Lucius was in his element, holding court, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He accepted congratulations, his laughter booming his charisma, a tangible force field. But his eyes kept darting across the room, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, anticipation, perhaps in their depths. Lucius, darling, a triumph as always, a gushing socialite, air-kissed them both. We do what we can, Brenda, Lucius replied with a practiced, self-deprecating charm. But the real future of this house is standing right over there. He gestured towards the stage, where a willowy woman with fire-red hair and a predatory smile was speaking to a cluster of fashion journalists. This was Giselle Dubois, Montclair Couture's new head designer, poached from a rival Parisian house with an astronomical salary. She was Lucius's latest, most celebrated acquisition, hailed as a design prodigy who would propel the brand into the stratosphere. Cress had met Giselle only once, a brief, chilly introduction, where the designer's eyes had swept over Cress with a look of utter disinterest, as if she were a piece of outdated furniture. Now, watching her command the room, Cress felt a prickle of unease. I need to go speak with the press, darling, Lucius said, squeezing her arm. Mingle. Look radiant. He left her side, and she felt instantly adrift. She made her way through the crowd, nodding and smiling, her mind 1,000,000 miles away. She found a quiet alcove near a balcony, seeking a moment of respite. The cool night air was a relief. From her vantage point, she could see most of the ballroom. She saw Lucius make his way over to Giselle. He didn't join the press circle. Instead, he drew Giselle away towards a shadowed corridor behind a large floral arrangement. Cress's unease sharpened into a cold dread. She told herself she was being paranoid hormonal, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she slipped out of the alcove and moved towards the corridor, keeping to the edges of the room. The thumping bass of the music masked her footsteps. As she neared the floral display, she could hear their voices low and intimate. The collection is a masterpiece, but you, my dear, are the true work of art. Lucius was saying, his voice a low purr she hadn't heard him use with her in years. And you are the patron who knows how to display it. Giselle's throaty laugh replied, Is your lovely little incubator enjoying the party? The casual cruelty of the word incubator struck Cress with the force of a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. She plays her part, Lucius said dismissively. She's content. As long as she has her charities and her nesting instincts, she's perfectly manageable. Cress peeked through a gap in the orchids. She saw Lucius's hand slide from Giselle's waist to cup her face. He leaned in and kissed her, not a peck on the cheek, but a deep, lingering kiss, filled with a passion Cress had only ever dreamed of. Time seemed to stop. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull roar. In that moment, Cress's world, already cracked, shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the complete and utter negation of her existence. She was a part, a manageable incubator. Her love, her pregnancy, their life together, it was all a sham, a carefully managed piece of brand strategy. She stumbled back, knocking a waiter's tray. A single champagne flute teetered and then fell shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo the breaking of her own heart. The sound made them both turn. Lucius's eyes widened not with guilt or remorse, but with pure, unadulterated annoyance. He strode out of the corridor, Giselle a smug shadow behind him. "Cressida," he said, his voice dangerously low, his eyes cold as ice. "What are you doing, skulking in the corners?" Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. "I saw you, Lucius." He glanced at the onlookers who were beginning to stare, his face hardening into a mask of public control. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and steered her towards a side exit. "Don't you dare make a scene here," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. "You will ruin everything." "You ruined everything." She finally choked out the words, raw and ragged. "Our marriage, our baby." They were in a deserted hallway now. He finally let her go, pushing her against the wall. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and she saw nothing but contempt. "Our baby," he scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic. It's a convenient distraction for you, isn't it? Something to keep you busy. You should focus on your little hobby. You know the baby." The words from the opening hook, the final fatal blow. He had taken the one pure, precious thing in her life, their unborn child, and twisted it into another insult, another way to diminish her. Something inside Cress snapped. The grief, the shock, the years of quiet subservience, it all coalesced into a single clarifying moment of cold, hard certainty. She looked him dead in the eye, her tears suddenly gone, replaced by an unnerving calm. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "I should focus, but not on the baby, on getting as far away from you as I possibly can." Before he could react, she turned and walked away. Not back to the party, but down the hall past the kitchens and out a service exit into the cold night air. The city lights blurred as she walked a taxi's headlights, cutting through the darkness. She didn't look back. She left behind the diamonds, the silk gown, the penthouse, the lies. She walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, a life growing inside her, and the chilling echo of her husband's final unforgivable words. The shattering was complete. Now all that was left were the ruins. The cold night air hit Cress like a slap, a brutal awakening from the suffocating warmth of the gala. The emerald silk gown felt like a costume from another life, thin and useless against the city's unforgiving chill. Her manicured hands, accustomed to the soft leather of a chauffeured car, fumbled in her tiny clutch. She had her phone, a lipstick, and a single credit card, a supplementary card on Lucius's account, which she knew would be cancelled by morning. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She was pregnant alone and effectively homeless on a downtown street corner. The towering skyscrapers that once represented a life of luxury now seemed to mock her, their glittering facades cold and indifferent. For a terrifying moment, she had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone, and the friends she'd cultivated over the past few years were Lucius's allies, their loyalty bought and paid for by his influence. Then a memory surfaced, a beacon in the storm. Mrs. Peterson. Martha Peterson was her landlady from college, a kind, no-nonsense widow who rented out rooms in her modest but impeccably kept brownstone in a quiet, older part of the city. Cress had kept in touch, sending a Christmas card every year, a small link to a life that was truly her own. With trembling fingers, she found the number and called. "Cressida? Dear, is that you? It's past midnight. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Peterson's voice was warm but laced with concern. A sob escaped Cress's lips, the first sound she'd made since leaving the hotel.
"No,"
she whispered the word, cracking.
"Nothing is all right. Can I come over? I have nowhere else to go."
There was no hesitation. "Of course, dear. The kettle's always on. Come home." Home. The word was a balm to her shattered soul. A taxi ride across the city felt like a journey across worlds. She left the sleek, modern steel and glass of Lucius's district and entered a neighborhood of brick buildings, fire escapes and laundromats that glowed warmly in the dark. Mrs. Peterson opened the door before Cress even knocked. She was a small, sturdy woman with kind eyes and hair the color of steel wool. She took one look at Cress's tear-streaked face and the ridiculously opulent gown and simply opened her arms. Cress collapsed into her embrace, the raw, unfiltered grief she'd been suppressing, finally erupting in a storm of sobs. Mrs. Peterson led her inside, sat her down at the worn oak kitchen table, and wrapped a thick knitted afghan around her shoulders. She placed a steaming mug of chamomile tea in Cress's hands and sat opposite her, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. Over the next hour, the whole sordid story came pouring out, the dismissiveness, the affair with Giselle, the final cruel words about the baby. Mrs. Peterson listened without judgment, her expression a mixture of sorrow and a quiet, simmering anger on Cress's behalf. "That man," she said, finally, her voice firm, "is a fool of the highest order. To throw away a diamond because he's too busy admiring cheap glass." That night, Cress slept in the small attic room she had rented as a student, the scent of lavender and old books a comforting lullaby. The mattress was lumpy. The sheets were faded cotton, not Egyptian, but for the first time in years, she felt safe. The next few weeks were a brutal adjustment. The first thing she did was take the taxi to a consignment shop and sell the emerald gown and the diamond earrings she was wearing. The money was a pittance compared to their worth, but it was hers. It was enough for a few weeks' rent to Mrs. Peterson, who initially refused, but relented when Cress insisted a simple wardrobe of second-hand clothes and groceries. The whiplash of her new reality was staggering. One day she was attending fittings for custom maternity wear. The next she was counting change to see if she could afford organic milk. The nausea of her first trimester returned with a vengeance amplified by stress and a diet that no longer included chef-prepared, nutrient-balanced meals. She was exhausted emotionally and physically. Some days the weight of her grief and fear was so heavy she could barely get out of bed. She would lie there, one hand on her growing belly, and weep for the future she had lost, and for the child who would be born into this chaos. Lucius made no attempt to contact her. The credit card was cancelled within hours, as she'd predicted. A week later, a curt email from his lawyer arrived informing her that divorce proceedings had been initiated and that given the circumstances of her desertion, she should not expect a generous settlement. There was no mention of the baby. It was as if she and their child had been surgically excised from his life. The cold corporate cruelty of it all reignited a spark of anger within her. It was a small spark, but in the darkness of her despair, it was enough to see by. Mrs. Peterson was her rock. She would leave trays of toast and soup outside Cress's door, never pushing, but always present. She'd coax her out for walks in the local park, encouraging her to feel the sun on her face. "One foot in front of the other, dear," she'd say. "That's all anyone can do." Slowly, painfully, Cress began to piece herself back together. The storm was still raging, but she was no longer adrift. She was learning to build a raft. She started sketching again, not for a business,
but for herself. She drew the faces she saw in the park, the intricate patterns of leaves on the sidewalk, the way the light hit the brick buildings at sunset. It was a way to reclaim a part of herself that Lucius had tried to extinguish. She was no longer Cressida Montclair, the millionaire's wife. She was Cress Bishop, a designer, a survivor, and a mother-to-be. And in the quiet anonymity of her new life that felt like a promotion, months bled into one another. The city transitioned from the crispness of late autumn to the deep freeze of winter. Cress's belly grew round and full, a constant living reminder of the new life she was now solely responsible for. The sharp, acute pain of Lucius's betrayal had dulled into a persistent heavy ache, but her focus had shifted. Her survival and the well-being of her baby became her entire world. She found a quiet rhythm in her life with Mrs. Peterson. She helped with chores around the house. Her sketches began to fill a new portfolio, and she even took on some small freelance jobs designing logos and brochures for local businesses. The pay was meager, but the sense of accomplishment was immeasurable. Each dollar she earned was a brick in the foundation of her new independent life. One particularly cold and snowy afternoon, with the city hushed under a blanket of white, Mrs. Peterson asked for her help clearing out some old boxes from a storage closet. "My old bones aren't what they used to be," she said with a smile. Amongst the dusty relics of a life well lived, Cress found a small wooden trunk tucked away in a corner. It was hers. Her mother had sent it to Mrs. Peterson for safekeeping when Cress had first moved in with Lucius, filled with childhood mementos and things that didn't fit into the sterile minimalism of the penthouse. She had completely forgotten about it. Curious, she pried open the lid. Inside were photo albums, her old art school projects, and a collection of her grandfather's things. Robert Bishop had been a master tailor, a quiet, meticulous man who had passed away when Cress was in her late teens. He had been her first mentor, the one who taught her about the feel of different fabrics, the importance of a perfect stitch, the soul that could be woven into a garment. She lifted out his old sewing kit, the heavy shears he used to cut cloth, and a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was not jewelry, but a single ornate old-fashioned brass key and a thick sealed envelope made of heavy parchment. Her name, Cressida, was written on the front in her grandfather's elegant looping script. Her heart pounded as she broke the wax seal. The letter inside was dated a week before he passed away. "My dearest Cressida, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I hope that you have found happiness in your life. I am writing to you about a part of my past I rarely spoke of. Long before I was a simple neighborhood tailor, I was a partner in a business. I was the craftsman, the artist. My partner was the salesman, the visionary. Together we founded a small but exceptional textile company called Ariadne Weavers. We created fabrics of unparalleled quality. Over time, my partner, a man named Jonathan Montclair, wanted to expand into fashion, into a world of glamour and branding that held little appeal for me. We had different visions. I wanted to create art. He wanted to build an empire. We parted ways amicably. I sold him my operational shares, but I kept my founding stake, a silent, controlling interest in the parent company we had established. I had no interest in boardrooms or stock markets, but I wanted to ensure the legacy of our quality was protected. I put these shares into a blind trust for you, my only grandchild. The company evolved, and Ariadne Weavers became the foundation of what you now likely know as Montclair Couture. Jonathan's son, and perhaps his grandson, may have forgotten that the roots of their grand empire lie in the hands of a quiet tailor. This key will open a safe deposit box at the Sterling National Bank downtown. Inside you will find the trust documents. They are structured to give you full control upon your 30th birthday, or under a force majeure clause, which can be enacted in the event of significant personal distress or upheaval. My lawyer, a brilliant man named David Chen, holds the second key and the full instructions. His card is enclosed. This is your legacy, Cressida. Not a weapon, but a shield. It is the fruit of my life's work. Use it to protect yourself, to build something beautiful and true, and to ensure that true craftsmanship is never sacrificed for the sake of empty glamour. Be happy, my dear girl. With all my love. Grandfather Robert Cress read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking so violently the parchment rattled. Montclair Couture, Lucius's company. Her grandfather was the silent founder. It seemed impossible a fantasy. She stared at the heavy brass key in her palm. It felt impossibly real. A shield, he had called it. Right now, she needed a shield more than anything. The next morning, driven by a dizzying mix of hope and disbelief, she called the number on the enclosed business card. A calm, professional voice answered. Law offices of Chen and Associates. My name is Cressida Bishop, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. I was told to contact a Mr. David Chen. It's regarding my grandfather, Robert Bishop. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Chen has been expecting your call for a very long time, the voice replied. Can you come in this afternoon? The law office was in a sleek, modern building, a world away from Mrs. Peterson's cozy brownstone. But Cress walked in not as a supplicant, but as a woman on a mission. David Chen was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He greeted her not with pity, but with a deep professional respect. He already had his key. Together they went to the bank. The safe deposit box was opened, and inside, nestled in a leather-bound folio, were the documents. As Mr. Chen explained the complex legal language, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her grandfather hadn't just left her some stock. He had left her a 52% controlling interest in the holding company that owned Montclair Couture and all its assets. It was an ironclad, unassailable majority stake. Because Lucius's father had diluted his own shares over the years to fund acquisitions and pay off debts, Lucius's own portion, which he believed gave him ultimate control, was only around 35%. He was a king ruling a kingdom he didn't actually own. Your grandfather's force majeure clause is quite clear. Mr. Chen explained, his voice calm and steady, as he looked at the heavily pregnant, determined woman before him. Your current circumstances, divorce, financial abandonment, more than satisfy the conditions. The trust is now yours to command. The question is, Ms. Bishop, what do you want to do with it? Cress looked down at the documents at her grandfather's name, entwined with the Montclairs. She thought of Lucius's sneering face, of Giselle's cruel nickname for her, of the way her dreams had been casually crushed. But more than that, she thought of her grandfather's words, build something beautiful and true. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. The storm hadn't broken her. It had washed away the debris and revealed the foundation that had been there all along. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice clear and strong. I want to call a meeting, an extraordinary general meeting of the shareholders. and I want to introduce them to their new majority owner." The discovery of her inheritance didn't trigger an immediate, vengeful charge. Instead, it ignited a slow, deliberate fire within Cress. The months of helplessness and fear were burned away, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. She was no longer a victim adrift in a storm. She was the storm itself, gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to make landfall. David Chen became her general, her strategist. They met not in his gleaming corporate office, but in the quiet, sunlit parlor of Mrs. Peterson's brownstone, a war room hidden in plain sight. Over cups of tea and plates of biscuits, they pored over decades of company financials, board meeting minutes, and shareholder reports. Cress wasn't just claiming an inheritance. She was earning it. She devoured every document, learning the intricate dance of corporate governance, finance, and law. She discovered the company's weaknesses, its strengths, and most importantly, the rot that had set in under Lucius's leadership. While Montclair Couture's public image was stronger than ever, thanks to Giselle's flashy, critically acclaimed but astronomically expensive new collection, the company's finances told a different story. Lucius was leveraging assets to fund lavish marketing campaigns and his own exorbitant lifestyle. He had fired dozens of long-serving loyal employees, master tailors, pattern makers, and textile experts who had been with the company for decades, some since her grandfather's era, replacing them with cheaper, less experienced labor to cut costs. He was sacrificing the very soul of the company, its commitment to quality craftsmanship, for short-term buzz and profit. He was turning her grandfather's legacy into a hollow, gilded shell. "He's arrogant," David Chen observed one afternoon, tapping a finger on a damning quarterly report. "He believes he's untouchable. That's our greatest advantage. He won't see us coming." Their plan, which Cress privately named the Phoenix Agenda, was twofold. First, they needed to consolidate her power silently. While her 52% stake gave her control, David advised acquiring a few more percentage points on the open market through a proxy buyer. This would not only fortify her position, but also create a small stir, a tremor that might put Lucius on edge, but wouldn't reveal the true source of the earthquake to come. "We make him look for a threat from a rival corporation or a hedge fund," David explained. "He'll be looking in the wrong direction, scanning the horizon for battleships, while our submarine glides right underneath him." Second Cress needed to be ready. It wasn't enough to be the owner. She had to be the leader. She spent her days studying and her nights sketching. But now her designs weren't for a quaint baby line. They were for a new Montclair Couture, a collection that honored her grandfather's commitment to fabric and form, but was infused with a bold, modern vision. It was a vision of strength, resilience, and quiet power. Everything she herself was becoming. As her due date approached, her resolve only hardened. The kicks and flutters in her womb were a constant reminder of what she was fighting for, not just for herself, but for her child's future, a future free from the shadow of a man like Lucius Montclair. Meanwhile, Lucius remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware. Cress's quiet disappearance from his life was to him a problem solved. He was seen at every party, every opening, with the triumphant Giselle Dubois on his arm. The press hailed them as the new power couple of fashion. In a widely circulated interview, Lucius was asked about his recent divorce. "Sometimes people grow in different directions," he'd said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "My focus has always been, and will always be, on the future of this company. I require a partner who shares that vision, not one who is distracted by domestic trivialities." The words relayed to Cress by David were like fuel on the fire. Domestic trivialities. He was talking about their child. A week before the annual shareholders' meeting, Cress gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Grace. Holding her daughter in her arms in the quiet hospital room, looking into her tiny, perfect face, Cress knew every fear, every tear, every moment of struggle had been worth it. This was not just about taking back a company. It was about reclaiming her life and building a legacy of strength for her daughter. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived a cool, crisp morning 6 weeks after Grace was born. Lucius was expecting a routine victory lap. The press was already lauding his incredible turnaround of the brand. He had prepared a triumphant speech about record-breaking sales from Giselle's latest collection and his bold vision for the future. Cress, however, was preparing for battle. She left Grace in the loving care of Mrs. Peterson. She didn't dress in a flashy, attention-grabbing gown. Instead, she chose a custom-tailored suit of her own design, made from a deep charcoal grey wool that her grandfather would have admired. It was elegant, powerful, and understated. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional chignon, and her face, though tired from sleepless nights with a newborn, was set with a resolve of forged steel. As David Chen held the door of the car for her, outside the corporate tower that bore the Montclair name, he gave her a final reassuring nod. "Ready, Ms. Bishop?" She took a deep breath, the city air cool and clean. She thought of her grandfather's letter of her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib. She was no longer the broken, weeping woman who had fled into the night. She was a phoenix, risen from the ashes, and she was about to claim her sky. "I'm ready," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and power that was entirely her own. The Montclair Couture boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass-walled sanctuary of power overlooking the sprawling city. It was designed to intimidate with a long, imposing table of polished black granite and chairs that resembled minimalist thrones. The shareholders and board members, a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits, were already assembled. At the head of the table sat Lucius Montclair, radiating an aura of absolute command. He was tanned, smiling, the very picture of a man at the apex of his success. Beside him, in a seat of honor, usually reserved for the COO, was Giselle Dubois, looking smug and victorious in a shockingly red dress. She was not a board member, but her presence was a clear statement of her power and influence within Lucius's new world order. "As you can see from the preliminary reports," Lucius began, his voice smooth and confident, "Giselle's Metamorphosis collection has not only garnered universal acclaim, but has also driven sales up by 200% this quarter. Our stock price is at an all-time high. The future of Montclair Couture has never been brighter." He launched into a self-congratulatory speech filled with buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and brand actualization. He painted a picture of a future built on his singular, brilliant vision. The board members nodded along their expressions, ranging from impressed to sycophantic. It was at that moment, just as Lucius was pausing for dramatic effect, that the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman they didn't recognize. She was flanked by the formidable David Chen, whose reputation as one of the city's sharpest corporate lawyers preceded him. The woman was poised, her expression unreadable, her tailored grey suit a stark contrast to Giselle's flamboyant red. She radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. Lucius frowned, irritated by the interruption. "I'm sorry, this is a private meeting. Security." But before anyone could move, David Chen stepped forward, placing a slim leather portfolio on the granite table. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Montclair. We are precisely where we are supposed to be." Cress stepped into the room, her heels clicking with quiet purpose on the marble floor. Her eyes swept across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second on Giselle's confused sneer, before finally landing on Lucius. Lucius stared at her. Recognition dawned, slowly contorting his features into a mask of pure disbelief. This was Cressida, but it wasn't. The timid, accommodating woman he had discarded was gone. This woman was a stranger, powerful, confident, and looking at him not with heartbreak, but with an unnervingly calm detachment like a scientist observing a specimen. "Cressida," he finally stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, filling the suddenly silent room, "is Ms. Bishop, and I am here to attend my first shareholders' meeting." A confused murmur rippled through the room. "Shareholder," one of the board members scoffed. "With all due respect, the shares held by employees and minor investors don't grant access to this meeting." David Chen opened his portfolio. "Ms. Bishop is not a minor investor," he stated calmly, sliding official notarized documents across the table towards the board's chairman. "She is the sole beneficiary of the Robert Bishop Blind Trust. As of 2 months ago, she has taken active control of that trust." The chairman, a portly man named George Finney, picked up the documents, his eyes widening as he read. "The Bishop Trust, but that's been dormant for decades. It's a founding stake." His voice trailed off as the implication hit him. He looked up, his face pale. "To be precise," David Chen continued, "the trust holds 52% of the voting shares of the parent company, Montclair Holdings International. My client, Ms. Cressida Bishop, is the new majority owner." The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight of pure shock. You could have heard a pin drop. Giselle's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed horror. The board members stared first at the documents, then at Cress, their minds scrambling to process the impossible truth. Lucius's face had drained of all color. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. "That's impossible," he breathed, shaking his head. "It's a lie. My father, your father knew." Cress said, her voice cutting through his denial like a shard of glass. "He knew that the foundation of this entire empire belonged to my grandfather, the man whose artistry he built his brand upon, and then conveniently forgot. You, however, seem to have been kept in the dark." She walked slowly around the table until she stood directly opposite him. "You spoke of your vision for the future," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But your vision is one of debt disposability and disrespect for the legacy that made this company great. You fired craftsmen who had dedicated their lives to this house to fund her overpriced, overhyped collections." She gave a curt nod towards a horrified Giselle. "You leveraged the company's assets to fund your own ego. You have mistaken flash for substance and buzz for value." She placed her hands on the back of the chair at the head of the table. "Effective immediately, I am exercising my rights as majority shareholder. This board is adjourned. A new meeting will be called tomorrow to elect a new board of directors. Mr. Montclair, your position as CEO and chairman is terminated. You have 1 hour to clear your personal belongings from your office. Security will escort you out." Lucius just stared at her, speechless, his empire crumbling around him in the space of 5 minutes. "You can't do this," he finally whispered, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. Cress leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, intense pitch for his ears alone. "You once told me to focus on my little hobby. You were right. I found one. It's called owning your entire world. You said a son would be good for the brand's legacy. You were wrong. A daughter is." With that, she straightened up and addressed the stunned room. "My name is Cressida Bishop, and I am the future of this company." The silence in the boardroom stretched for a full 10 seconds, a vacuum of pure shock that sucked all the air from the room. Then it fractured. Lucius Montclair, who had stood frozen as if turned to stone, finally came back to life, but as a grotesque parody of his former self. The charismatic control vanished, replaced by a raw, sputtering rage. "Fraud!" he roared, his voice cracking. He slammed his fist on the black granite table, a gesture that lacked its intended power and only betrayed his desperation. "This is a fabrication, a pathetic, vengeful fantasy. My lawyers will bury you. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Cress didn't flinch. She stood her ground, a pillar of calm in his storm. "On the contrary, Lucius," she replied, her voice level and cold. "You are the one who has no idea. You never did. You saw a quiet wife, not a founder's heir. You saw a hobby, not a legacy. Your blindness is not my problem." Her composure seemed to enrage him further. He turned his pleading, wild eyes to the board members, the men and women who had idolized him just minutes before. "Finney, tell her this is absurd. We are Montclair Couture. George Finney." The chairman meticulously avoided Lucius's gaze. His attention suddenly glued to the documents in his hands, as if they were the most fascinating text he had ever read. The other board members followed suit, shuffling papers, checking their phones, doing anything to avoid being caught in the blast radius of their fallen leader. They were sharks, and they could smell the blood in the water. Their allegiance had already shifted their minds furiously, calculating how to best position themselves in this new regime. Seeing no help there, Lucius's fury collapsed into a pathetic, desperate plea. "Cressida, Cress, please," he whispered, the change in tone jarring. "We can talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding. We can work something out, a settlement." It was the sight of Giselle that cut him short. Her face, a mask of horror, was twisted with a fury that mirrored his own. But her anger was aimed at him, the man whose power had been her shield and her platform. With a strangled cry of disgust, she shot Cress a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, grabbed her ludicrously expensive handbag, and fled. Her stiletto heels clicked a frantic, panicked rhythm on the marble floor, the sound of an era of cheap spectacle running for its life. Her exit seemed to be the final nail in the coffin. Lucius deflated the fight, draining out of him, leaving a slumped, hollowed-out man. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked his age. The two security guards who entered the room were almost a mercy, their impassive presence putting an end to the humiliating spectacle. They flanked him, their quiet professionalism, a stark contrast to his emotional disintegration. As they led him toward the door, he finally looked at Cress one last time, his eyes searching for something. Pity, regret, a flicker of the woman he once knew. He found nothing but the cool, steady gaze of a stranger who now owned his entire world. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing with a profound finality. The reign of Lucius Montclair was over. The boardroom was still thick with tension. Cress allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, letting the new reality cement itself in the minds of everyone present. Then she turned to the pale-faced chairman. "Mr. Finney, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Please schedule the extraordinary meeting for 9 a.m. tomorrow. My office will forward you the agenda and the list of my proposed new board members. You are all welcome to tender your resignations beforehand if you feel you cannot align with the new direction of this company." It was a clear, professional dismissal. David Chen gave a slight, satisfied nod, gathering his papers. As the shaken board members filed out, avoiding her eyes, he placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You were magnificent, Ms. Bishop." Cress let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep sense of exhaustion and a startlingly clear sense of purpose. "This was just the first step, David," she said. "The real work starts now." Her first day as chairwoman of Montclair Holdings was a blur of calculated action, but she didn't begin in the executive suite. She bypassed the elevators and took the service stairs down to the workshops, the true heart of the company. When she entered, a hush fell over the room. The remaining artisans, the cutters, seamstresses, and textile experts looked up from their work, their faces etched with the anxious uncertainty of people who had grown used to the axe falling without warning. She gathered them together, standing not on a platform, but among them on the worn wooden floor. "My name is Cressida Bishop," she began, her voice resonating with warmth and sincerity. "Some of you may have known my grandfather, Robert Bishop." A few of the older workers exchanged surprised glances. An elderly tailor at the back, a man with hands gnarled from 60 years of holding a needle, let out a soft gasp. He remembered. "My grandfather believed that a garment's soul is in its fabric and its stitch." Cress continued, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "He believed in substance, in quality, in the irreplaceable value of a master's hand. This company was built on that belief, and under my leadership we are returning to it." She then announced her first executive order, the immediate reinstatement of every single craftsman Lucius had fired, with full back pay and a formal apology from the company. A wave of stunned disbelief was followed by a ripple of applause that grew into a heartfelt ovation. The old tailor, his eyes glistening with tears, stepped forward. "Robert Bishop," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the finest man I ever knew. He would be so proud of you today, miss." In that moment, Cress wasn't just a CEO. She was a promise fulfilled, a legacy restored. Over the next few weeks, the transformation of Montclair Couture was seismic. Cress's Phoenix agenda was not just about a hostile takeover. It was a complete cultural and creative resurrection. The new motto she installed, etched onto the lobby wall, where a giant portrait of Lucius used to hang, was substance over spectacle. She walked through the design studio, which felt sterile and soulless under Giselle's tenure. Tucked away in a corner, she found Helen, a veteran pattern maker in her late 60s, who was quietly packing her things, assuming she would be next to go. Cress approached her and asked to see her personal sketchbook. Hesitantly, Helen revealed pages filled with designs of breathtaking elegance and structural genius ideas Lucius and Giselle had dismissed as too classic. "Helen," Cress said, her voice gentle but firm, "I'm not accepting your resignation. I'm offering you the position of head designer." The woman stared at her, speechless, as Cress explained her new vision, a company led by the talent that had been its bedrock all along. The most symbolic change was the C-suite itself. Lucius's office had been a monument to his ego, all black marble chrome and oversized modern art with a desk the size of a small car. Cress had it all stripped out. The dark walls were painted a warm, inviting white. Sunlight, once blocked by imposing blinds, was allowed to flood the space. In place of the massive desk, she brought in a large communal work table, covered in fabric swatches and sketchbooks, and in the sunniest corner, she placed a beautiful hand-crafted bassinet. Her daughter Grace would often sleep there as Cress worked a living, breathing symbol of the company's new life, a future that was female, nurturing, and creative at its core. One evening, months after the takeover, Cress stood at the vast window of that transformed office, holding a sleeping Grace in her arms. The city lights glittered below, no longer mocking her, but spread out before her like a kingdom of her own making. She thought of the woman she had been, the heartbroken wife, fleeing a party in a borrowed gown, the terrified mother-to-be huddled in Mrs. Peterson's attic room. She thought of the weight of her grandfather's key in her palm, the key that had unlocked not just a fortune, but the strength that had been inside her all along. The world was calling her story a tale of revenge. But as she looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, she knew it was something more profound. Revenge was a fire that consumed itself, leaving only ash. What she had done was an act of restoration. She had saved a legacy from ruin and built a future for her child. She was no longer a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the architect of her own destiny, a creator, a leader, and a mother. She had walked out of her old life broken, but in doing so had discovered the parts of herself that were truly unbreakable. Her reign, the reign of a bishop, had only just begun. And there you have it, the incredible story of Cressida Bishop, a story that proves that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest souls. She went from a broken, pregnant wife with nothing to her name to the powerful leader of a fashion empire, not through revenge, but through resilience, intelligence, and by reclaiming a legacy she never knew she had. Her journey reminds us that our true strength often lies dormant, hidden in our history, and in our character, just waiting for a crisis to awaken it. It's a powerful lesson that sometimes losing everything is the only way to truly find yourself and build something even more magnificent in its place. What did you think of Cress's ultimate power move? Was Lucius's downfall everything you hoped it would be? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of strength and poetic justice, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story of triumph, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to light. Thank you for listening.